The Atlantic Ocean. It is not merely a body of water, it is a colossal, breathing entity that covers more than 20% of the Earth's surface. For centuries, it has served as the ultimate bridge between the old world and the new, carrying explorers, conquerors, immigrants, and merchants across its vast expanse. It is a theater of human ambition. But beneath its rolling, silver-crested waves lies a much darker reality. The Atlantic is a fathomless blue cemetery, a keeper of humanity's most terrifying secrets and profound tragedies. Beneath the deceptively calm surface rests the wreckage of thousands of vessels, skeletons of wood and steel slowly being consumed by the crushing pressure and the salt. If the ocean could speak, it would echo with the silent screams of the souls who have been swallowed by its depths. The Atlantic does not care for the hubris of mankind. It respects neither wealth nor technology. Today, we are going to turn back the hands of time. We will plunge into the freezing, lightless depths to name and explore the 10 most terrifying events to ever unfold in this proud, yet unimaginably brutal, stretch of water. 1. RMS Titanic, 1912. The fall of a proud icon. To understand the true terror of the RMS Titanic, one must first understand the era that birthed her. The year was 1912, the twilight of the Edwardian era, a time defined by an intoxicating, almost blinding belief in human progress. The Industrial Revolution had convinced mankind that nature could not just be tamed, but utterly conquered, and the Titanic was the ultimate monument to this dangerous arrogance. Constructed by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, she was a leviathan of steel, the largest moving object ever built by human hands at the time. She was dubbed the Ship of Dreams and, more fatally, declared unsinkable. The ship was a floating palace, boasting opulence that rivaled the grandest hotels in Europe, intricate wood paneling, Turkish baths, squash courts, and a grand staircase crowned with a wrought iron and glass dome. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the scent of expensive cigars, roasted meats, and the lively melodies of ragtime music playing in the first-class lounges. The wealthy elites of society toasted to their own invincibility, insulated from the harsh realities of the natural world outside. But outside, the Atlantic was waiting. The night of April 14, 1912, was dangerously beautiful. The ocean was completely flat, resembling a massive mirror of black obsidian. There was no moon, only a canopy of cold, brilliant stars reflecting off the glassy surface. This unnatural stillness was, in fact, a deadly trap. Without waves breaking at its base, an iceberg is almost entirely invisible in the dark until it is too late. And out there in the freezing void, a white assassin lay in wait. It was a massive slab of ancient ice, calved from a glacier in Greenland thousands of years ago, drifting silently into the shipping lanes. It was a piece of nature's raw, unfeeling power, perfectly positioned in the path of mankind's greatest technological marvel. Despite receiving multiple warnings about ice from other ships in the area, the Titanic continued to tear through the freezing waters at a relentless speed of 22.5 knots. The operators in the Marconi room were too busy sending personal messages for the wealthy passengers to pay proper heed to the final, most crucial ice warnings. The hubris of the era had manifested as complacency. At 11:40 p.m., the lookout in the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet, peered into the freezing wind and saw a shadow darker than the night sky growing dead ahead. He rang the warning bell 3 times and grabbed the telephone. Iceberg, right ahead, down in the bowels of the ship. The engineers frantically reversed the massive steam engines, and the helmsman spun the wheel as far as it would go. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the Leviathan might just slip past, but momentum is a cruel master. The collision itself was not the spectacular, deafening crash one might imagine. For those in the upper decks, it was felt merely as a slight shudder, a vibration that rattled the silver cutlery and caused a few spilled drinks. Some passengers even went out onto the deck to playfully kick chunks of ice that had fallen aboard. But below the waterline, the reality was catastrophic. The iceberg had acted like a giant, blunt can opener, grazing the starboard side and popping the iron rivets over a length of 300 feet. The sea had found a way in. The true terror of the Titanic does not lie in the moment of impact. It lies in the agonizing, slow-motion realization of inevitable doom. Over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, the illusion of human supremacy shattered piece by piece. When Captain Edward Smith was informed by the ship's architect, Thomas Andrews, that the ship would undeniably founder. A cold dread set over the command crew. There were only enough lifeboats for about half the people on board, a result of outdated regulations and the aesthetic desire to keep the deck uncluttered. The unsinkable ship was bleeding out, and mathematics dictated that hundreds were going to die. As the bow began to dip lower into the water, the terrifying quiet of the Atlantic night was broken by the hiss of steam venting from the pipes and the chaotic launching of the lifeboats. At first, passengers refused to leave the warm, brightly lit ship for the fragile wooden boats suspended over a terrifying 60-foot drop to the black water. The first boats were lowered half empty. But as the tilt of the deck grew steeper, and the freezing water began creeping up the grand staircase, panic took hold. The social order collapsed. Down in the third-class steerage, hundreds of immigrants, locked behind iron gates to prevent them from mingling with the wealthy, found themselves trapped in a freezing labyrinth. Their desperate struggles in the dark, rising waters remain one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the tragedy. Above deck, the scene was surreal. The ship's band, in a legendary display of stoicism, continued to play music on the sloping deck to calm the terrified crowds. Their lively tunes turning into somber hymns as the end drew near. Flares were fired into the star-studded sky, bursting in brilliant flashes of white light, silently begging the empty horizon for help that was too far away to arrive in time. By 2:15 a.m., the angle of the ship was extreme. The massive propellers lifted entirely out of the water, gleaming monstrously against the night sky. The structural stress on the ship's hull was too much. With a terrifying roar of tearing steel and breaking machinery, the mighty Titanic snapped in two. The lights, which had miraculously stayed on, flickered one final time and plunged the scene into absolute, pitch-black darkness. The stern section bobbed on the surface for a few minutes before the ocean finally pulled it down. Then came the most horrific part of the night. For the 1.500 people plunged into the water, the shock of the cold was immediate and lethal. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius. It felt like 1,000 knives piercing the skin. The air filled with the sounds of screaming, a chaotic, desperate chorus of voices calling for loved ones, begging the lifeboats to return. Those in the half-empty lifeboats sat just a few hundred yards away, paralyzed by the fear that if they rowed back, their boats would be swamped by the drowning masses. So, they sat in the dark and listened. Slowly, over the course of 20 agonizing minutes, the frantic screaming faded into a chorus of moans, and then, eventually, fell into a chilling, absolute silence. The Atlantic had reclaimed its territory. The sinking of the RMS Titanic remains an eternal obsession. It is not just a story of a shipwreck, it is a profound moral play about class, hubris, and the limits of human engineering. It stands as a terrifying reminder that no matter how big we build our ships, no matter how much we believe in our own invincibility, the ocean will always be vastly deeper, infinitely colder, and utterly unforgiving. 2. The Bermuda Triangle, Flight 19, When Space Warps and Reality Fractures. To speak of the terrifying history of the Atlantic Ocean without mentioning the Bermuda Triangle is to ignore the darkest shadow on the nautical map. Bounded roughly by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, this invisible geometric shape covers roughly 500.000 square miles of open ocean. For centuries, it has been a realm of whispers and paranoia. Even Christopher Columbus, sailing through these waters in 1492, noted erratic compass readings and strange lights dancing on the horizon. But the true, modern terror of the Triangle, the event that cemented its name as a synonym for the inexplicable, did not involve a ship slowly sinking into the waves. It involved the sudden, violent erasure of 5 military aircraft from the very fabric of reality. This is the harrowing mystery of Flight 19. The date was December 5, 1945. World War II had officially ended just a few months prior, and a palpable sense of relief had washed over the United States. At the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, the atmosphere was relaxed, focused on routine training rather than the grim realities of combat. The Atlantic sky was a brilliant, unblemished azure, the weather categorized as ideal for flying. It was supposed to be a perfectly ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Flight 19 was designated as Navigation Problem Number 1, a standard training exercise designed to teach pilots how to navigate using dead reckoning, calculating their position based on speed, time, and direction. Without the aid of landmarks, the squadron consisted of 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers. The Avenger was a formidable machine, a heavy, rugged aircraft affectionately nicknamed the Turkey by its pilots. It was built to withstand intense anti-aircraft fire and carry heavy payloads. It was not a fragile plane prone to falling out of the sky without reason. 14 men were assigned to the flight that day. 13 of them were trainees, though many already had significant flight time. Leading them was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a seasoned combat veteran with over 2.500 hours of flying experience. Taylor had survived the brutal Pacific theater, having been forced to ditch his aircraft into the ocean on 2 separate occasions and living to tell the tale. He was a man who knew how to handle a crisis. At exactly 2:10 p.m., the heavy Wright Cyclone engines of the 5 Avengers roared to life. They thundered down the Fort Lauderdale runway and lifted off, arranging themselves into a tight, disciplined V formation as they headed east over the shimmering Atlantic. The flight plan was a simple triangle. Fly east for 56 miles to Hens and Chickens Shoals to drop practice bombs. Continue east for another 67 miles toward the Bahamas. Turn north for 73 miles. And finally angle back southwest to return to the Florida coast. It should have taken no more than 2 hours. The first leg of the journey went flawlessly. Fishermen near the shoals reported seeing the 5 bombers circling and dropping their practice payloads precisely on target. Up to this point, the universe was behaving according to the laws of physics and logic. But as Flight 19 turned onto its second heading deeper into the Atlantic, a creeping, invisible sickness began to infect the mission. At roughly 3:40 p.m., another flight instructor flying near the Florida coast, Lieutenant Robert F. Cox, picked up a strange transmission on the training radio frequency. Someone was calling a pilot named Powers, but the voice sounded strained, tinged with a subtle but unmistakable layer of panic. Cox keyed his microphone and asked if someone was experiencing trouble. The response he received remains one of the most chilling radio transmissions in aviation history. It was Lieutenant Taylor. "Both of my compasses are out," Taylor reported, his voice cutting through the static. "And I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am over land but it's broken. I am sure I'm in the Keys but I don't know how far down and I don't know how to get to Fort Lauderdale." This statement was the genesis of the nightmare. It was geographically impossible for Taylor to be over the Florida Keys, the string of islands trailing off the southern tip of Florida. He would have had to fly hundreds of miles in the exact opposite direction of his flight plan. How could a veteran pilot experience such severe spatial disorientation? Taylor, who had recently transferred to Fort Lauderdale, was unfamiliar with the topography of the Bahamas. When he looked down and saw a string of islands scattered across the blue water, his brain, desperately trying to make sense of his broken compasses, forced the landscape to fit his worst fear. He believed he was lost over the Keys, heading south toward the open Gulf of Mexico. Cox logically advised Taylor to fly north, keeping the sun on his port, left, side, to follow the Florida coastline back up to Fort Lauderdale. But here is the fatal, terrifying paradox. Taylor was not in the Keys. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, over the Bahamas, north of his target. By following Cox's logical advice to fly north to escape the Keys, Taylor was actually leading his 5 planes away from the mainland, deeper and deeper into the vast, unforgiving void of the open Atlantic Ocean. The situation in the cockpits of Flight 19 began to unravel. As the afternoon wore on, the idyllic Florida weather began to curdle. Dark, bruised storm clouds rolled in, churning the sea below into a chaotic mess of whitecaps and deep troughs. The sun, their only reliable navigational anchor, began to sink toward the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the endless water. The radio transmissions, heavily degraded by atmospheric static and the increasing distance, painted a terrifying psychological portrait of men slowly realizing they were going to die. Descent began to fracture the discipline of the squadron. The trainee pilots, looking at their own compasses and trusting their training, realized the horrific mistake their commander was making. Through the crackling radio, ground stations intercepted frantic, heartbreaking arguments between the men. "Damn it," one student pilot was heard saying, his voice thick with frustration and mounting terror. "If we would just fly west, we would get home. Head west, damn it." But military protocol demanded absolute obedience to the flight leader. Taylor, paralyzed by confusion and perhaps suffering from a severe case of vertigo, refused to turn west. He became convinced they had somehow drifted over the Gulf of Mexico. He ordered the squadron to fly east, searching for the Florida coast, further sealing their doom. The psychological horror of those final hours is unimaginable. Picture sitting in a small, vibrating metal cockpit, the sky growing dark, the weather deteriorating into a gale, watching the needle of your fuel gauge slowly, relentlessly drop toward zero, all while knowing your commander is flying you directly away from safety. You are trapped in a machine that is functioning perfectly, actively carrying you to your death. By 6 p.m., the situation was catastrophic. The sun had set, plunging the Atlantic into total darkness. The radio signals were fading into a ghostly hiss, bouncing off the ionosphere. The radio direction finders on the mainland were desperately trying to triangulate their position, finally realizing that Flight 19 was far out over the Atlantic, north of the Bahamas. But it was too late. The planes were too far out, and the weather was too severe for a rescue operation to reach them in time. Taylor's final, coherent transmissions are a haunting testament to human resignation in the face of the absolute abyss. He had stopped looking for land. He was preparing his men for the inevitable. All planes close up tight. Taylor's voice crackled through the dark one last time. We will have to ditch unless landfall. When the first man gets down to 10 gallons, we all go down together. And then, nothing. Only the cold, hissing static of the radio. 5 aircraft, 14 men, swallowed by the night, leaving behind no wreckage, no oil slicks, no life rafts, and no bodies. But the hunger of the Atlantic was not yet satiated. The terror of Flight 19 was about to claim more victims. As soon as it became clear that Flight 19 was lost, the Navy scrambled rescue aircraft. Among them was a Martin PBM Mariner, a massive twin-engine flying boat with a crew of 13 men. Designated Training 49, the PBM Mariners were rugged rescue planes, but they possessed a fatal design flaw. They were notorious for accumulating explosive gasoline vapors in their bilges, earning them the grim nickname, Flying Gas Tanks. Training 49 lumbered into the dark, stormy sky, heading toward the last known estimated position of Flight 19. At 7:27 p.m., the Mariner radioed a routine message to the base, stating they were nearing the search sector. They were never heard from again. 23 minutes later, the crew of the SS Gaines Mills, a merchant tanker plowing through the heavy seas off the coast of Florida, witnessed a terrifying spectacle. Against the pitch-black canvas of the night sky, a massive ball of fire erupted, burning with intense, blinding fury. The explosion was so violently bright it illuminated the storm clouds for miles. The flames cascaded down from the sky, crashing into the ocean and burning on the surface for several long, agonizing minutes. When the tanker arrived at the coordinates of the explosion, they found only a slick of oil and debris too small to identify. No survivors were found. In a single, incomprehensible afternoon and evening, the United States Navy had lost 6 aircraft and 27 men in a routine training zone. The ensuing investigation was one of the most extensive in naval history. Yet it yielded no comforting answers. Hundreds of ships and planes scoured over 200,000 square miles of the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico, finding absolutely nothing. Not a single rivet of an Avenger was ever recovered. The official Navy report concluded with a chilling admission of defeat, a sentence that birthed a modern myth. The board stated they could not explain the disappearance, writing, "We are not able to even make a good guess as to what happened. They vanished as completely as if they had flown to Mars." The disappearance of Flight 19 remains the ultimate narrative of the Bermuda Triangle. It is terrifying precisely because it defies logic. It strips away our comforting belief in the reliability of our machines, the certainty of our compasses, and the fundamental rules of navigation. It suggests that there are places on this earth, out over the deep, ancient waters of the Atlantic, where the geometry of reality simply fractures, where up becomes down, where north becomes south, and where human beings can slip through the cracks of existence, leaving behind nothing but static and an enduring, unanswerable silence. 3. Mary Celeste, 1872. The ghost ship of the open sea. There is a specific, primal fear associated with the concept of a ghost ship. A shipwreck, while tragic, offers a grim finality. It is a violent struggle ending in defeat against the elements. But an abandoned vessel, found drifting perfectly intact on the open ocean with its crew vanished into thin air, represents an entirely different kind of terror. It is a locked room mystery where the room is a wooden construct surrounded by millions of square miles of hostile, fathomless water. Of all the maritime enigmas that the Atlantic Ocean has produced, none is more infamous, more chilling, and more enduringly terrifying than the tale of the Mary Celeste. To grasp the profound horror of this event, one must first understand the man at the helm. Captain Benjamin Spooner Briggs was not a reckless adventurer or an inexperienced sailor prone to panic. He was a 37-year-old devoutly religious man, a seasoned master mariner who commanded immense respect from his peers. He had spent his entire life on the water and was known for his stoic, cautious nature. He was a man who understood the brutal realities of the sea and took no unnecessary risks. Especially not on this voyage, for on this particular journey, the cargo was not just freight, it was his family. Joining him on board was his beloved wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia. They were sailing alongside a hand-picked, highly experienced crew of 7 men. On November 7, 1872, the Mary Celeste, a beautiful, sturdy 282-ton brigantine, slipped its moorings in New York Harbor. Its destination was Genoa, Italy. Below its decks sat a volatile but valuable cargo. 1.701 wooden barrels of highly concentrated, undrinkable industrial alcohol. The weather was fair, the ship was in immaculate condition, and the mood was optimistic. The vessel sailed eastward, shrinking into a tiny white speck against the vast canvas of the Atlantic. Before disappearing over the horizon, they were sailing directly into a mystery that would never be solved. Nearly a month later, on the afternoon of December 4, 1872, another ship, the British brig Dei Gratia, was fighting its way through heavy swells roughly 400 miles east of the Azores. The captain of the Dei Gratia, David Morehouse, was standing on the deck when the lookout spotted a sail in the distance. As the two vessels drew closer, Morehouse noticed something deeply unsettling about the other ship's behavior. The sails were set in a haphazard, illogical manner. Some were torn, flapping violently in the wind, while others were missing completely. The ship was yawing wildly, moving in an erratic, drunken zigzag across the waves, completely at the mercy of the currents. Through his spyglass, Morehouse recognized the vessel. It was the Mary Celeste. Morehouse actually knew Captain Briggs. They had dined together in New York just days before their respective departures. Recognizing his friend's ship moving so recklessly sent a cold spike of dread through Morehouse's heart. He ordered his crew to signal the vessel, but the Atlantic wind carried back no response. There was no one at the ship's wheel. The deck was completely, terrifyingly devoid of human life. Driven by an ominous sense of foreboding, Morehouse dispatched his chief mate, Oliver Devoe, and a small boarding party in a rowboat to investigate. As Devoe pulled himself over the wooden railing and stepped onto the damp deck of the Mary Celeste, he was enveloped in an eerie, suffocating silence, broken only by the creaking of the ship's timbers and the sloshing of the sea. What the boarding party found, or rather, what they did not find, would become the stuff of maritime nightmares. The ship was not sinking. In fact, it was eminently seaworthy. While there was some water in the hold, it was a negligible amount for a wooden ship of that era. And the ship's hull was completely intact. But as Devoe ventured deeper into the vessel, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The silence was heavy with unseen panic. Down in the captain's cabin, the scene was entirely undisturbed, as if frozen in time. The beds were unmade. Personal belongings, including valuable jewelry, money, and Briggs' beloved harmonium, were left untouched. Underneath a small cot, the indentation of a sleeping child could still be seen, alongside a few scattered toys belonging to little Sophia. In the galley, the ship's stores contained enough food and fresh water to last the crew for 6 months. The cargo of 1.701 barrels of alcohol remained securely lashed in the hold. Completely ruling out any theory of a pirate attack, pirates would have stripped the ship bare of anything valuable. Yet, there were subtle, horrifying clues that painted a picture of a sudden, desperate evacuation. The ship's single small lifeboat, a fragile wooden yawl, was missing. The vessel's main halyard, a thick, sturdy rope used for hoisting sails, was found broken and trailing off the stern into the water. Its end frayed as if it had snapped under immense tension. One of the ship's pumps had been dismantled, lying useless on the deck. And perhaps most chillingly, the ship's logbook and navigation instruments were gone. The last entry in the logbook was dated November 24, 10 days earlier, placing the ship nearly 400 miles away from where she was currently drifting. For 10 days, the Mary Celeste had sailed herself, an unguided ghost, through the Atlantic swells. But what could possess a veteran captain like Benjamin Briggs to order his wife, his toddler, and his entire crew to abandon a perfectly sound, well-stocked ship in the middle of the unforgiving ocean, climbing into a tiny, open rowboat with no shelter and little hope of survival? Over the past century and a half, theories have swirled like a maelstrom around the Mary Celeste. People whispered of mutiny, though there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and no weapons found drawn. Others concocted wild tales of giant squids, sea monsters, or sudden madness, but the most terrifying, and arguably the most plausible, explanation is deeply rooted in the psychology of terror and the unforgiving nature of the sea. The key to the mystery likely lies in the cargo. When the Dei Gratia crew inspected the hold, they noted a foul, overpowering stench of alcohol vapor. Upon closer inspection, it was discovered that 9 of the 1.701 barrels were empty. Unlike the rest of the barrels made of white oak, these 9 were constructed from porous red oak, allowing the highly flammable alcohol to slowly leak and evaporate into the confined, unventilated space of the ship's belly. Imagine the scene. It is late November. The Mary Celeste is rolling through heavy seas. Down in the hold, the fumes have been building for weeks. Suddenly, perhaps due to a shift in cargo or a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, a massive cloud of noxious vapor erupts from the hold, possibly accompanied by a terrifying rumbling sound or even a small, flash fire explosion. Briggs, a cautious man, is suddenly faced with his absolute worst nightmare. He believes his ship is about to detonate. He believes the wooden hull beneath his family's feet is a bomb seconds away from tearing them apart. Panic, raw and paralyzing, overrides years of training. He makes a split-second, fatal decision. He orders everyone to immediately evacuate into the small yawl. He grabs the navigation instruments, intending to trail the ship at a safe distance. He uses the heavy main halyard to tether the small lifeboat to the stern of the Mary Celeste, waiting for the vapors to clear, waiting for the danger to pass. But the Atlantic is a cruel trickster. As they sit in the small, freezing boat, watching the massive wooden hull of their home, a sudden squall blows in. The wind catches the immense sails of the Mary Celeste. The ship violently jerks forward, the heavy halyard straining against the sudden, immense weight of the accelerating ship and the drag of the lifeboat. Pulls taut, and then snaps with the sound of a gunshot. This is the true horror of the Mary Celeste. It is not a tale of ghosts or monsters. It is a tale of utter, paralyzing despair. Picture Captain Briggs sitting in the fragile yawl, his arms wrapped around his terrified wife who is clutching their weeping 2-year-old daughter. Picture the 7 seasoned sailors, men who had faced down hurricanes, now sitting powerless with mere wooden oars in their hands. They look up, and the sight that greets them is the most horrifying thing a sailor can witness. The Mary Celeste, their sanctuary, their only lifeline in a vast, indifferent wilderness of water, is sailing away. They watch the massive white sails fill with wind. They watch the wooden hull cut through the waves, growing smaller and smaller in the distance. They scream. They row frantically until their hands bleed, but they cannot catch the wind. They are left behind, 10 souls in a tiny wooden bowl, surrounded by thousands of miles of deep, freezing, black water. They had abandoned a perfectly safe ship out of an illusion of danger, only to condemn themselves to the most terrifying, slow, and lonely death imaginable. The Mary Celeste survived, drifting silently into history, a wooden monument to their fatal mistake. But Captain Briggs, his family, and his crew were swallowed by the abyss, leaving behind an eerie silence that still echoes across the Atlantic today.